might add just that it's not as difficult as you might think to once you are a witness, like Ben was, and you talk to the people who were actually being victimized. It's quite easy to talk to their boss, the crew chief, because one thing you have to understand. I mean, there are different definitions of slavery, and Brazil's definition is a bit broader, and I think it's a real definition, and it's that there doesn't have to be a guy with a gun standing guard over these people. Slaves are not necessarily bought and sold. In fact, in most cases, they're not. Economic coercion is just as powerful tool to force people to do this as a guy with a gun. And in Latin America, what I found, also I think it's in other parts of the world, is these are people that are recruited who live in worse misery than they may even be. They're living in parts of the world where there's no work at all, and somebody comes to them and says, "Hey, we want to hire you. We want to take you to the Amazon to cut down trees or dig for gold, and we're gonna take you there. We're gonna pay you a decent wage. You're gonna be able to send money home to your family, or we're gonna take you to northern Mexico. You're gonna pick tomatoes for export. We're gonna pay you a decent wage for 8 months out of the year, and then you're going to go home and live the rest of the year. Your kids are going to be able to eat for the rest of the year." And it's a very enticing offer, and a lot of people do it. And then once they get in the middle of nowhere and they have no money to get out, they're stuck, because they know if they do leave and they haven't been paid for months, they're never going to get paid. So I heard this over and over again. I can't leave because if I leave, they're never going to pay me. So I'm just going to keep working. Hopefully they'll pay me. But anyway, so you're not, in most cases, it's, in terms of reporter, I never felt in danger at all, especially in Brazil, because I was surrounded by cops with machine guns. But in Peru, where there was absolutely no government action against this, it was just me and my photographer, Paulo Perez, and this kid who had taken it upon himself to try to help the people digging gold out of the jungle. But I was, you just walk up and these people have never seen journalists in their lives usually, and the foreman's there just sitting around, and you just start talking, and he'll say, "Oh yeah, we sell our gold to this guy in town who pays you whatever per gram of gold," or in the charcoal camp, and I don't know if you'll understand why charcoal is involved, but the charcoal that these slaves were making is used to fuel the blast furnaces that turns iron ore into raw iron, which is called pig iron. So that's how it all starts. Anyway, so in the charcoal camps, I asked the guy who was in charge, who buys this stuff, and they said, "Oh, this company Cosipar," which turns out to be a steel plant. I mean, a big, huge industrial plant, a legitimate exporter. And so once you get that first lead, you just, you start doing your research on the wire. And in Peru, I just went to the place where they sold the gold nuggets they were getting out of the sand, and I said, "Oh, who buys your gold?" And they're like, "Oh, this guy in Lima, a broker, and he sends it to the United States and Europe and Switzerland." And so then I went to the guy in Lima. I said, "Who do you sell to?" And it's like, "Oh, we sell to this Canadian company," and it turned out to be one of the biggest gold smelting and brokerage firms in the world. And then I went to them, and they didn't want to talk to me, but I looked on the website and figured out that they basically supply gold bullion to all the banks in the world. That's what they do. They ship them. And the same thing with the Brazilian story, that I found out that this company Cosipar sells to this broker in I just called him. I called the guy on the phone in Chicago. It's like one guy, I think, in the office. And I started chatting with him. I said, oh yeah, you know, I understand Cosapar is your customer. Yeah, they're a customer. We buy, you know, tens of thousands of tons of pig iron a year from them. And then I just started chatting, and he started telling me who his customers were. And it, you know, and it led me to Ford and the auto parts makers. And so you would be surprised what people tell you when you just ask. And then once you have those leads, you just keep going to each name you get and see what they'll tell you, or a lot of times on the internet, on their websites, it lists their customers. But the important thing is that, like David said, we had this debate over, well, are you sure that the charcoal in that place went into a piece of pig iron that went into this paperclip? You know, this very one. Like, no, I'm not sure. But it goes into a giant pool of everything, so it sort of, it taints the whole lot when you're talking about things like this. So as long as you know that the company that made this ends up, it all begins here, you know, you've got it nailed down, just like fish too.
Right.
I just want to make Cosapar had signed an agreement with other Brazilian pig iron producers that they would not use slave labor because it was an acknowledged problem, right? And in Brazil, and the government had been fighting it for some time. So it's not as if what Mike witnessed was unknown to Cosapar. That it was a acknowledged problem. They publicly pledged that they would not do this anymore. And Mike essentially just witnessed that they were buying product that was, you know, they had pledged they would not buy. So what he found was something that was hardly unknown to the company, and that they had publicly pledged they would not do, but they did it anyway.
I'm struck by a couple of differences with our investigation. The first, again, comes back to this issue of the Brazilian government's responsiveness, even before you went in there, to the issue of slave labor. In New Zealand, this is one of the early journalists who's been working on this had uncovered that which wasn't hard to uncover, it was in public records, but the head of the National Party, which is the governing party in New Zealand, his family was also the largest single shareholder in the largest company that was using these slave-infected foreign charter vessels. And New Zealand's a small place, but that's a really tight circle. And so, you know, the speculation was, and we didn't speculate on this in the piece, but the speculation was that was one of the reasons why the New Zealand government hadn't been more robust, hadn't given more explicit orders to the Ministry of Fisheries observers who had seen, for example, Korean officers cracking the heads open of Indonesian workers when they weren't working fast enough, literally cracking the heads open. As one whistleblower put it, blood was pissing out all over the squid. And when they reported it to their superiors, the response was essentially just count the fish. You know, or your only concern is the biological resource. You know, the human rights of these individuals beyond 12 miles, that's murky legal territory. And without leadership at the highest level, even before it went into the print magazine, the day afterwards, the CEO of Mazetta Corporation, which is the largest importer of New Zealand seafood into the United States, and the CEO, Tom Mazetta, is a very close friend of Aaron Barrett, who is the CEO of the largest publicly held fishing company in New Zealand, sent a letter to his very close friend, copying all of the shareholders in Sanford, which is the New Zealand company, and saying, among other things, leadership takes responsibility. In light of these detailed allegations, changes must be made in order for us to continue our existing relationship. It was a very forceful letter. It was something that frankly nobody in New Zealand expected to see, and it was a message to Sanford, a 130-year-old company worth some $375 million, that they could not continue to operate the way they were operating. And very, very swiftly, they began to change internally. Ultimately, they were forced to change by virtue of the government banning foreign charter vessels. But it's, again, it's a striking example, I think, of how responsibly asking the questions of, and that's, I think, a key element of this, that again I took from your investigation, giving American corporations the right of response in a diligent and assertive manner, but also a fair manner, makes all the difference in terms of their eventual response to their suppliers. So with that, we have about 15 minutes left, and I would love to field any questions. Please approach the mic and ask them. And if you could identify yourself too, that would be terrific.
Sure. I'm Celia Wexler. I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I have one short comment and then a question. Michael made the point about the sort of globalization and that impact on what we're seeing, and I didn't know if people were aware of the fact that the administration recently issued an executive order that is talking about the harmonization of global standards and has aggressively asked businesses to comment. And if anybody wants more information about that EO, I'm happy to give you my card. It's kind of wonky, but it's important. The question is, you talked about sort of the various ways slavery expresses itself, and I wondered if you had plans or had done any work about clinical trials. As you know, American drugs mostly are now the clinical trials are done abroad, and although it's a little bit of a different situation, you have people with very little U.S. inspection who are undergoing clinical trials of drugs, some of them dangerous, and the question is, do they even know what they've signed on to, and if you pursue that at all. Thanks very much.
Well, funny you should say that, because the way I got my current job at Bloomberg, which is, I think, the best job in journalism, because all I do is stories like this now, was because I was brought in by my current editor to help, when I was at Bloomberg News, just a reporter in Brazil, to help document a story about the use of illegal immigrants in Miami to do clinical trials, and a company that was contracted by all major pharmaceutical companies to run clinical trials in the United States, and they preyed on illegal aliens who just needed money, and they used a little bit of money to convince them to go to trials, and they didn't have a clue what they were getting into. I mean, the difference there is that's not slavery, it's extreme exploitation. It was just straight wrong, and that's what I mean by, if you're interested in outing or denouncing or effecting change to improve people's lives who are being severely exploited because of who they are, where they live, their immigrants or basic rights, then you can do it without it necessarily being slavery, because there's a lot of deep wrongs going on in terms of labor that you can report on, which are just as, you don't have to go necessarily to extreme slavery. Sure.
Please.
Hi, I'm Jenny Wilson from Bloomberg. I worked on the story last year. Hi, I'm Jen Abelson with Boston Globe, and I worked on the story last year about fisheries labeling, so I'm really curious about the tracking that you guys did in terms of the supply chain and how you went about it, because it is such a murky field.
Terrific. Did you say you'd done a piece on the fishing industry for the Globe?
Yeah.
We were absolutely using your work, so thank you. No, it was one of the other difference, other than the governmental responses on this, were the industry responses that I hear between our pieces, where the fishing industry is so remarkably opaque, were you reporting on mislabeling?
Yeah, recent mislabeling.
Yeah, excellent work. That was one of the really striking things is, from your work and others, the findings that in many cases you're buying a species of fish that's advertised as one species and it's a completely different species. To say nothing of when it was caught or the kind of rigorous details that you would hope for a volatile product or a spoilable product anyway, like fish. What we found was that the companies, for example, Whole Foods, that you would think would be the most transparent on their supply chains. The specific response that we got from the Whole Foods representative when we asked on record, where does this fish come from? They say, well, that's proprietary. It was a little striking because this is a product that we want to put in our bodies potentially. Not anymore, but it was just as a consumer that was revelatory to me, and it was worth putting in. And eventually, the final response from Whole Foods on this that we printed was the Department of Labor does not list New Zealand as a high-risk country. So that was the response that we printed. And now, in fairness to them, after the piece came out, they instituted a trace register program. They began to get transparent, and now, as you may have seen, they've banned trawler-caught fish from their stores entirely. So, in theory, that would take care of part of the problem. In practice, Sophie found New Zealand hoki, which is one of the questionable species that we were looking at on Whole Food shelves. Yesterday, 2 weeks ago. So, thank you.
Hi, Michael Graybell from ProPublica. I'm wondering if you have tips of going the other way, starting in a U.S. city and then trying to trace a slavery from that end rather than from Brazil up the chain. So I think a lot of us would have trouble pitching our local editor of going overseas to do reporting, but in every community there's going to be some store or big player that is relying on the slave labor and the supply chain to get its products.
Mike and I were talking about this morning, and I have a couple of suggestions, and they may be slightly unsatisfying, but there's a Harvard professor, John Ruggie, who developed these principles for companies to essentially, and they're voluntary principles for companies to ensure that their supply chain doesn't have labor abuses in it. I'm sort of broadly characterizing it. And this is something that was endorsed by the UN, and there are many companies that are grappling with the Ruggie principles. And if you go by different industries, there's pressure in different industries to eradicate labor abuses in their supply chain. So one way to get at it, without concretely saying, Jacques, we found that you are, abusing people on fishing boats or people in gold mining camps, is to say to corporations, what are you doing? And there's plenty of big corporations out there that could be held to account or not for what they're doing to ensure the decency of their supply chain. That's gotten very little publicity, really, the Ruggie principles. And then the other thing is in the Dodd-Frank bill, there's a provision that companies are supposed to report to the SEC their use of minerals from conflict-afflicted countries. And there's been an enormous backlash against that by the Chamber of Commerce and by other industry, and the SEC has not promulgated their regulations, as I understand it. And that also hasn't gotten much publicity, but that would be a doable story.
Please.
Hi, Matt Kaufman with the Hartford Current. I'm curious if you work with any anti-trafficking groups, Free the Slaves, I've worked with or just had contact with, Anti-Slavery International, Not for Sale, places like that. And if so, if you sort of had a take on them, were there any that you found particularly helpful? In particular, were there any that you had some concerns about, kind of where their hearts really lay?
Yeah, it's kind of all over the map. As I said, I've been working in the field for 10 years. First of all, on the New Zealand story, the short answer is no. We didn't work with any anti-trafficking groups because, simply put, there just weren't any dealing with the populations that we were looking at. And so our sources were entirely fishermen. There was a mariner who had sort of, I think, finally established a charitable trust to help some of the fishermen after they'd escaped, to help with their legal costs as they pressed suit in the high courts in New Zealand against these companies. But the larger question of the anti-slavery community, it's really a mixed bag. I've seen some what I would evaluate as pretty effective practices, and then a lot of effective fundraising on not so effective practices. I don't want to go NGO by NGO and evaluate, but I think actually a pretty good benchmark, at least at the outset, is the Charity Navigator. Going and seeing what kind of ratings and what the breakdown of the budget allocation is for each of the NGOs. Certainly, I'm on record as, and I give a quarter of the royalties in my book to Free the Slaves. I worked with a couple of their partners overseas and found them to be quite effective. And then but I wasn't giving a thumbs up or thumbs down. I was giving a description, and it turns out that one of the descriptions that I gave was very detailed, and they read it as rather critical, and eventually they dropped the partner. So that's probably the sign of a good NGO that won't continue doing what they don't see as being effective work. And then I wrote about another NGO in Sudan called Christian Solidarity International that was partnered with their American entity was the American Anti-Slavery Group based here in Boston. Their big MO was going in and quote-unquote redeeming slaves, buying slaves en masse in order to set them free. And they claimed, by the time I was traveling with them, I was doing a story for Newsweek at the time, that they had redeemed some 82,500 slaves. This is in an area where the most reliable studies say that as many as 12,000 were taken over the course of the Civil War, the Second Civil War. So it's, numerically it just doesn't add up, and I reported on that. So again, it's a broad range.
I also want to say there's a really good website, the Business and Human Rights Resources Center does a nice job of aggregating a number of websites, and that's www.business-humanrights.org. It's definitely worth a look.
Hi, Michael Blanding. I'm a senior fellow at the Schuster Institute. So I'm wondering what you think about the role of the consumer in all of this. I think it's really wonderful and amazing that these companies, after your story came out, put this pressure on their supply chain and actually got some changes. But I think that most consumers, they read articles like this and they sort of throw up their hands and say, this stuff is so prevalent that there's no point in doing boycotts or not buying certain products because this thing is just everywhere. And I'm wondering if you think that there is a role for consumers in putting pressure, and if so, how do you engage them through the work?
That's an excellent question. I'll give a brief response, and then you guys, I'm sure, will have something to add. But the one thing that I was struck by, and I think you guys mentioned that you were struck by this as well, is how organized consumer response is on environmental issues and how poorly organized it is on labor issues. And again, we're journalists, we're not activists. As you well know, as a fellow at the Schuster Institute, we have our only biases for the truth. We go out and we try to seek the truth and tell it to the public. But it is curious. I was curious to see that, frankly, on the New Zealand story, the corporate response really led the consumer response. It came out before the consumer response on the part of the companies that were, had their act together. Walmart was within 2 hours. Some of the others were, took a week or so. But I had a call from the CEO of the largest seafood importer in North America at 7 p.m. on a Friday and said, "Hey man, you just totally ruined my day. My 2 biggest customers, Safeway and Walmart, just called me up and asked me why I'm selling them slave-caught fish. It's not a good day for me." And he said, we had a conversation, and he claimed that I was mistaken, that the processing facility in Weihai, China, was totally clean. He said, they have 99% retention after the Chinese holidays, et cetera. So it goes on for about half an hour, and I said, are you finished? Sorry, sir, I know more about your supply chain than you do at this point. And in his, to his credit, he called a couple of weeks later and said, "Hey, we're really working to fix this. We're auditing." And that totally led consumer response. Obviously his buyers, his direct buyers, the companies, spoke up first, but it was.
So they, on their own, like I said, if they have their act together, will very quickly come down on any supplier that is suspected of doing this, and will put pressure on that supplier to change what they're doing to their satisfaction, or lose the business and go out of business in those cases. So I think for some reason there's already a conscience, if you will, generated by economic interests within big companies that if this gets out and my name is connected to it, people are going to buy what I make and I'll be in trouble. So you really don't need, I guess as a consumer you can write to a company and express your outrage, send them an email, I think, I don't know, but they already know about it and will react very quickly if this is brought to their attention.
I really hate to cut off conversation, but we're at the hour. If people would like to come and talk to me and perhaps you guys about best practices, about anything else, any other questions you have on our work or your own, we're eager to talk. For me, it's terribly inspiring to be in front of all of you who do such good work. And Lord knows we don't get paid enough, but hopefully you can sleep at night, and that's certainly one of the benefits of reporting on the kind of stuff that we do. So thank you all very much for coming.